Chapter 45 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 45. Ober-Alp. After Philip had looked sufficiently long at the caged eagle, he went in search of the captain, and found him smoking in the veranda of the hotel. "Lambert," said he, "there's a deal of fuss being made about this American lady. But who is she?" "Comes from Chicago," answered the captain. "I know that, but I want to know something more concerning her." The captain shrugged his shoulders. "She's good looking, deucedly so." "That, also, I can see for myself. Have you made no inquiries about her?" "I? Why should I?" Philip called the head waiter to him. "Here, who is this American lady?" "Oh, from Chicago." "Exactly, the visitors' book says as much. I don't see how she can be rich. She has no lady's maid." "Oh, sir, the American ladies are very independent." There was nothing to be learnt from anyone about Miss Durham. He applied to the squeaky-voiced chaplain with the military mustache. "She may belong to the Episcopal Church of America," said the chaplain, "but I don't know." Some of the waiters had seen her elsewhere, at other summer resorts, always well dressed. Philip, after he had spent half an hour in inquiries, discovered that no one knew more about her than himself. He had heard nothing to her disadvantage, but also nothing to her advantage. He might just as well have spared himself the trouble of asking. At table d'hôte, Miss Durham sat at the long table. Salome was disappointed. She thought that she had succeeded in completely patching up the difference. Philip was indifferent. Just as well that she should be elsewhere. She was an occasion of dissension, a comet that threw all the planetary world in his system out of their perihelion. He made no bones about saying as much. Salome looked sadly at him, when Colonel Yao took his seat beside Miss Durham, and entered into ready converse with her. She could not take her attention off her friend. She was uneasy for her, afraid what advantage the crafty colonel might take of her inexperience. But it was not long before Philip heartily wished that Miss Durham had been in her place in their circle, for conversation flagged without her, or ceased to be general and disintegrated into whisperings between the girls Labarte and confidences between Janet and Lambert. Salome was silent, and Mrs. Sidebottom engrossed in what she was eating. Philip spoke about politics, and found no listeners. He asked about the excursions to be made from Andermatt, and was referred to the guide-book. He tried a joke, but it fell dead. Finally he became silent as his wife and aunt, with a glum expression on his inflexible face, and found himself, as well as Salome, looking down the long table at Miss Durham. The young lady was evidently enjoying an animated and entertaining conversation with Colonel Yao, whose face became blotched as he went into fits of laughter. She was telling some droll anecdote, making some satirical remark. Philip caught the eye of Yao turned on him, and then the colonel put his napkin to his mouth and exploded. Philip's back became stiff. It offended him to the marrow of his spine, through every articulation of that spinal column, to suppose himself a topic for jest, a butt of satire. He reddened to his temples, and finding that he had seated himself on the skirts of his coat, stood up, divided them, and sat down again, pulled up his collars, and asked how many more courses they were required to eat. "Oh, we have come to the chicken and salad, and that is always the last," said Salome. "I am glad to hear it. I never less enjoyed a meal before, not even—" He remembered the dinner alone at Murgatroyd, with the parlour-maid behind his back, observing his mole. He did not finish his sentence. He did not consider it judicious to let his wife know how much he had missed her. It was not pleasant to be at enmity with a person who, by jibe and joke, could make him seem ridiculous, even in such eyes as those of Beeple Yao. It would be advisable to come to an agreement, a truce, if not a permanent peace with this woman. Presently Philip rose and walked down the salle. Several of those who had dined were gone. Some remained shelling almonds, picking out the least uninteresting of the sugar-topped biscuits and make-believe macaroons that constituted dessert. He stepped up to Miss Durham and said with an effort to be amiable and courteous, "We are meditating a ramble this afternoon, Miss Durham, to some lake not very distant, and I am exponent of the unanimous sentiment of our table when I say that the excursion will lose its main charm unless you will afford us the pleasure of your society." He had been followed by the Labarthe girls, and they now put in their voices, and then Mrs. Sidebottom joined. She came to back up the request. It was not possible for the American girl to refuse. The captain and Janet had not united in the request, but they had attention for none but each other. And Salome had not risen and united in the fugue, for a reason unaccountable to herself, a sudden doubt whether she had acted wisely in pressing the lady to stay after she had resolved to go. And yet she could give to herself no grounds for this doubt. A couple of hours later the party left the hotel. It was thought advisable that Janet should be taken to the summit of the pass in a small low carriage. She could walk home easily downhill. Into the carriage was harnessed an ungroomed chestnut cob that had a white or straw-colored tail and light-colored patches of hair about the hocks. It had the general appearance of having been frostbitten in early youth, or fed on stimulants which had interfered with its growth, and deprived it of all after-energy. The creature crawled up the long zigzag that leads from Andermatt to the Ober-Alp, and the driver walked by its head, ill-disposed to encourage it to exertion. The captain paced by the side of the carriage, equally undesirous that the step should be quickened, for he had no wish to overheat himself. Time was made for man, not man for time, and he had an agreeable companion with whom he conversed. Mrs. Sidebottom engaged the Labarthe girls, who, inconsiderate creatures, wanted to walk beside their Aunt Janet and take part in the conversation with the captain. Mrs. Sidebottom particularly wished that her son should be left undisturbed. As an oriental potentate is attended by a slave waving a fan of feathers to drive away from his august presence the tormenting flies, so did the mother act on this occasion for her son. She fanned away the obtrusive Labarthe girls. When she found that they were within earshot of the carriage, "Now," said she, "I am sure this is a short cut across the sward. You are young, and I am no longer quite a girl. Let us see whether you, by taking the steep cross-cut, or I, by walking at a good pace along the road, will reach that crucifix first." By this ruse she got the three girls well ahead of the conveyance, but Claudine found a patch of blue gentianella, and wanted to dig the bunch up. "No, no," advised Mrs. Sidebottom, "not in going out, on your return homewards. Then you will not have the roots to carry so far, and the flowers will be less faded." There was reason in this advice, and Claudine followed it. Presently Amélie, the second, exclaimed, "But we are just in advance of Aunt Janet. Let us stay for her." "Yes, we will," agreed Félicité, the third. "Claudine can go on with Madame." "We will all stay," said Mrs. Sidebottom. "Now, Amélie, I have seen your sketches, and you have your book with you. Is not that a superb view up the gorge to the right? I do not know the name of the mountain at the head. What a picture it would make! And finished off with the spirit you throw into a drawing. See, there is a chalet and some goats for foreground." "C'est vrai, I will draw it." So Amélie sat on a rock and got out her materials, and the sisters sat by her, talking and advising what was to be left in and what left out of the sketch. Meanwhile the conveyance containing Janet crawled by. The picture was still incomplete, and the little party was thrown a long way in the rear by this detention. To anyone observing the zigzag road up the Ober-Alp pass from a distance, the party would not have been supposed to possess homogeneity. At starting it was led by three, Philip, Salome, and the American lady, But after the first stage of the ascent, Salome fell back. Then, little by little, the other two quickened their pace till they had completely distanced the rest. At a lower stage of the inclined road, ascending at an even pace, was Salome alone. At about an equal distance below, on another stage of the zigzag, was the carriage with Janet and the captain, and the driver, of whom no account was taken. And sometimes ahead of the carriage, sometimes behind, making rushes, then halts, like a covey of doves followed by a hawk, was the little cluster of girls with Mrs. Sidebottom. From a distance, at one moment, the three girls seemed to be flying before the elder lady armed with a parasol, which she swung about her head. Then they seemed to cower on the ground into the herbage as birds beneath a swooping falcon. The reason why Salome was alone must be given. Before starting on the excursion, Philip said to his wife, "Let me have a minute alone with that person. I'll make some sort of apology and set all to rights." Accordingly, Salome had dropped back where the road made its first twist. But this does not explain why she remained alone for more than the minute. That this may be understood, it will be necessary to follow the conversation that passed between Philip and that person. "My wife has found a pink," said Philip. "She is fond of flowers." Then, as Miss Durham said nothing, he added, "I afforded you some amusement at dinner." "Amusement?" "Apparently. It is not pleasant to be an object of criticism. If you desired to punish me for my indiscretion, you must be satisfied. You made me very uncomfortable." "Amusement? Oh, do you mean when Colonel Yao laughed and looked at you? I saw you turn red." "Enough to make a man turn red when aimed at by the bow and arrow of female lips and tongue." "You are quite mistaken," said Miss Durham, laughing. "I was not shooting any poisoned arrow. Do you desire to know what I said?" "Interest me it must, as I was the object of the arrow, even if tipped with honey." "Very well, you shall know. I had seen you looking at the eagle in his cage, and I said to Colonel Yao that the eagle reminded me of you." Philip winced. He remembered his own estimate of that wretched bird. "And pray," said he, "why am I like the eagle?" "Because you are both in situations for which neither was designed by nature. Do you suppose the eagle looks the draggled, disconsolate bird he does now, when on wing, soaring over the glaciers? Were his wings made that they might droop and drop their crushed feathers? That stern eye, that it should stare at iron bars, at inquisitive faces peering between them? Now come, be open. Make me your confessor. Have you never had yearnings for something nobler, freer, than to be behind the bars of a counting-house, and condemned to the perpetual routine of business, like the mill of a squirrel's cage?" Philip considered. Yes, he had wished for a less monotonous life. He had often desired to be able to hunt and shoot and move in cultivated society, tour in Europe, and have leisure to extend his thoughts to other matters than the details of a lawyer's office or a manufacturer's set of books. "Your time is all barred," continued Miss Durham, "and the music of your life must be in common time. No elasticity, no initiative, all is barred and measured. Tell me something about yourself." I? This was a daring question to address to one so reserved as Philip. "I have had nothing occur in my life that could interest you." "Because it has been spent in a cage. I know it has. I can see the jail look in your face, in your back, in the way you wear your hair, in your coat, in your every action and look and tone of voice." "This is not complimentary." "It is true, but you were not made to be a jailbird. No one is. Only some get caught early and are put behind bars, and see the world and know it only through bars. The wind blows in on them only between bars, and the sun is cut and chopped up to them by bars and crossbars, and all they know of the herbs and flowers are the scraps of chickweed and plantain, drooping and dying, that are suspended to their caged bars for them to peck at. I know exactly what they come to look like who have been encaged all their lives. They get bald on the pole, and stiff in their movements, and set in their back, and dull of eye, and narrow of mind. You have not been a caged bird? Asked Philip with some animation. Oh no, not I. I have kept outside the bars. I have been too fond of my liberty to venture behind them. What do you mean by bars? Asked Philip with some gravity in his tone. Bars? There are bars of all sorts. Social, religious, conventional. But there I shock you. You have lived so long behind them that you think the bars form the circumference of the world, and that existence is impossible or improper outside of them. Beyond some, none are at liberty to step. They are essential. I am not talking of the natural, but of the artificial restraints which cramp life. Have you any Bohemian blood in you? Bohemian? Wild blood. I have, I confess it. A little drop of fiery African blood. You in England have your class distinctions, but they are nothing beside our American separations between white and black. With you, a blot on the escutcheon by a mésalliance is nothing. With us, it is ineradicable. There is a bar, sinister cast over my shield, and shutting me out from the esteem of, and association with, those whose blood is pure. Pure! It may be muddied with the mixture of villainous blood enough, of swindlers and renegades from justice, but that counts nothing. One little drop, an eighth part of a drop, damns me. I do not care. I thank that spot of taint. It has liberated me from conventional bonds, and I can live as I like, and see the sun eye to eye, without intervening bars. Philip had winced when she spoke about the coexistence of pure blood with that of swindlers and renegades. He stopped and looked back. They had been walking fast, though uphill. When talkers are excited and interested in what they say, they naturally quicken their pace. They had far outstripped Salome. As Philip looked back, he could not see her, for the ground fell away steeply and concealed the several folds of the road. What? Asked Miss Durham mockingly. Looking for one of your bars? Philip turned and walked on with her. They had reached the summit, and the ground before them was level. On this track of level, mossy moor lay the lake of deep crystal water, in which floated masses of snow or ice that had slidden from the mountain on the opposite side. Hardly a tree grew here, on this neck, exposed to furious currents of wind. "May I take your arm?" asked Miss Durham. "I am heated and tired with this long climb." Philip offered her the support she demanded. "I suppose," she said, "that you have not associated much with any but those who are caged birds." He shook his head and colored slightly. "Do you know what I am?" she asked abruptly, and turned and looked at him, loosing her hand from his arm. "I have heard that you are a lady with a large independent fortune." "It is not true. I earn my living. I am a singer." She saw the surprise in his face, which he struggled to conceal. "It is so, and I am here in this clear air that my voice may regain its tone. I sing on the stage." She put her hand through his arm again. "Yes, chained, imprisoned eagle, I am a free singing bird. What do you say to that?" What could he say? He was astonished, excited, bewildered. He felt the intoxication which falls on an evangelical preacher when he mounts the platform to preach in a music hall. He was frightened and pleased, his decorum shaken to its foundation, and cracking on all sides. "What do you say to that?" she asked, and looked full in his eyes, and her splendid orbs shot light and fire into his heart, and sent the flames leaping through his veins. He heaved a long breath. "Yes," she said, "you suffocate behind bars." Then she burst into a merry peal of laughter, and Philip involuntarily laughed also, but not heartily. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 46. Artemisia. "There is the restaurant," said Miss Durham, "and being painted within and without, impossible for us to enter. What say you to walking on to the head of the lake? I want to look over the Col and see the mountains of the Rhine valley above Disentis." Philip hesitated and again looked back. "I see," said Miss Durham. "You are afraid of stepping out of your cage." "Not at all," answered Philip, flushing. "I am prepared to go to the end of this trough in the mountains with you, but I greatly doubt seeing much from the further end." "Well, if we see nothing we can talk. Have you looked about you much since we began the ascent?" "The time has flown," said Philip, looking at his watch. "It seems to me but a few minutes since." The long dreary valley or basin in which lay the lake was apparently closed at the end by a hill surmounted by a cross or flagstaff. The road ran along the north side of the lake without a tree to shade it. The party behind, when they came to the restaurant, could not fail to see them if they continued along the road, and might follow or await them there. Philip walked on, but no longer gave Artemisia Durham his arm. He saw far away in the rear Mrs. Sidebottom signaling with her parasol, but whether to him or to the Labarte girls who were dispersed in the morass at the end of the lake, picking butterwort, soldanella, and primula, he could not tell. His eyes were on the ground. He was thinking of his companion. What a strange life hers must be, incomprehensible to him. He felt how, if he were thrown into it, he would not know how to strike out and hold his chin above water. At the same time his heart beat fast with a wild, vain desire for a freer life than that of commerce. The restraints to which he had been subjected had compressed and shaped him as the Chinese lady's shoe compresses and shapes her foot. But the pressure had been painful. It had marked him, but the marks were ever sensitive. The ancient robe of the Carmelite fathers was of white wool barred with black, and they pretended that they derived this habit from the mantle of Elijah, which he had dropped as he was being carried up to heaven, and the mantle had touched, as it fell, the spokes of the chariot of fire in which he ascended, and was scorched in stripes. Philip, and many another successful man of business who has been exalted to a position of comfort and warmth, has the inner garment of his soul scarred by the wheels of the chariot in which he has mounted. Philip felt his own awkwardness, his want of ease in other society than that narrow circle in which he had turned, his inability to move with that freedom and confidence which characterizes those born and reared in generous society. Even with this girl, this bohemian, he was as one walking and talking with chains to his feet and a gag to his tongue. She was right. He was born to be at ease everywhere, to be able everywhere to walk upright, and to look around him. He had been put in a cramping position, tied hand and foot, and his head set in such a vice as photographers employ to give what they consider support and steadiness, and he was distorted, stiffened, contracted. Had his life been happy? He had never accounted it so. It had been formal at the solicitor's desk, and it was formal in the factory. Was man made and launched into life to be a piece of clockwork? He had thought, acted, lived an automaton life, and taken his pleasure in measuring glasses, never in full and free draughts. "Have you had a happy existence?" he asked thoughtfully. "Oh yes, the birds are happy. All nature is happy so long as it is free. It is in the cage that the bird mopes, and in the pot that the plant sickens." Had Philip looked in her face, he would have seen a strange expression of triumph pass over it. She had carried her first point and gained his interest. "Here," she said, "is a large rock above the water. Let us sit on it, and I will tell you about myself. You had no confidence in me, and would not give me your story. I will return good for evil, and show you my past. I agree with you. There will be no view of the mountains above Dicentus from the col. It is not worth our while going on. Besides, I am tired. She took a seat on a broad boulder that had fallen from the mountains and hung fast, wedged on one side, disengaged on the other, over the crystal water that, stirred by the light wind, lapped its supports. Looking into the clear flood beneath, they could see the char darting about, enjoying the sun that penetrated the water and made it to them an element of diffused light. Artemisia pointed to them and said, "Who would not rather be one of these than a goldfish in a glass bottle?" Philip at once recalled the pond at Murgatroyd, with the hot water spurted into it from the engine, in which the goldfish teemed, and the globes in every cottage window supplied with the unfortunate captives from this pond, swimming round and round all day, all night, every year, seeing nothing novel, without an interest, a zest in life. Such had his career been. He, a fish, not a gold one, nor even a silver one till recently, but quite a common brown fish in a common glass receiver full of stale water, renewed periodically, but always flat. He looked at the darting char with interest. "We are in the land of freedom," said Miss Durham. "Then don't stand on the rock like a semaphore. Sit down beside me and let your feet dangle over the water." "Oh, as Polixenes says, to be boy eternal." "With such a day tomorrow as today," added Philip, completing the quotation as he seated himself on the rock. How wonderfully brilliant the sun was at that height, so utterly unlike the rusty ball that gave light at Murgatroyd, and there gave it charily. How intense the blue of the sky, dark as the deep-belled gentian, not the washed-out cobalt of an English heaven. And the air was fresh. It made the heart dance, and the pulses throb faster, with a trip and a fandango such as the blood never attains in our grey and sober land. At a few hundred yards' distance was a road mender leisurely performing his task, repairing a track made by a stone that had leaped from the cliffs above, torn up the road, and then plunged into the lake. Far behind could be seen Mrs. Sidebottom flourishing her parasol and gathering the rest of the disconnected party together before the restaurant. It was clear that she had decided they were not to go further, but to rest at one of the tables in the open air beside the lake, till it pleased the two of the advanced party to return. Had they been seen? Philip asked himself. Where he and Artemisia now sat, they were screened from observation from the tavern, though not from the road mender who was ahead on the way. "I am not quite sure," said Philip, and he fidgeted with his fingers as he said it. "I think I ought to be going back to the party, to my aunt." "To your wife, you mean? Why not say so?" "No, you shall not go. There are plenty with her, 5 in all, and I have only you." A flutter, and then a scalding rush of blood through Philip's veins. "This is the land of freedom," said Artemisia. "As you came over the lake of Lucerne, you saw Rutli, the sacred spot where the 3 confederates swore to shake off the chains that bound them and to be free. And its freedom is the glory of Switzerland now. Let this be Rutli. Break those conventional bonds that have tied you, and as a pledge remain seated and listen to me. Remember what I have told you. I want to give you a peep into my past life and have your advice." Philip made no more objection, but he plucked little scraps of sedum that grew on the stone and threw them into the water. Presently fish came to snap at them and turned away in disgust, leaving them when they saw they were not flies nor worms. "My mother," said Miss Durham, "was a German. That is how I can speak the language with as much ease as English. She was married to my father shortly after her arrival in America, and she never acquired the English tongue perfectly. She always spoke it with an accent and intonation that was foreign, but though she did not acquire perfectly the language of the country of her adoption, she assimilated its prejudices pretty easily, and held them with that intensity which characterizes, in my experience, acquired prejudices, especially when unreasonable. My father had in him a couple of drops of dark blood, and although my mother thought nothing of that when she took him, she speedily came to regard it as an indelible stain. She threw it in his teeth. She fretted over it, and when I was born, did not regard me with the love a child has a right to exact from its mother. The continual quarrels and growing antipathy between my parents led at length to their separation. My father left, and I believe is dead. I never saw him after they parted. He may have married again, I do not know, but I believe he is dead. He made no inquiries after me and my mother, to whom I was a burden and a reproach. She looked about for and secured another, a more suitable partner, a German working in a factory. They had children, fair-haired, moon-faced, thick-set, and I was alone amidst them, the drudge or enemy of all. I had a good voice, and I was made nurse to the youngest children, and to still them I was accustomed to sing to them. The eldest boy had a good clear voice also, and him I liked best of all my half-brothers and sisters. It was a great amusement to us to follow brass bands, or Italians with organs and monkeys, and when we saw how that these obtained money, my brother Thomas and I agreed together that we would try our luck. One day, it was the day of the Declaration of Independence, when everyone was out and all enjoying themselves, Tom and I went into the most frequented avenue of our town, and began to sing. Carriages with ladies and gentlemen passed, and troops of people in their best clothes, all in good humor, and all seeking amusement. We began to sing Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, Tom taking a second. Some Germans at once gathered about us and threw coppers into Tom's cap. Presently a man came up with a red beard and a violin. He stood for a long time listening, and then instead of giving us money, he asked where we lived and what our parents were. I told him, and next day he came to see my mother. He was a musician, and he offered to buy me of her, that he might teach me to sing and accompany him. Philip's face grew gray, and the lines in it became more marked. He no longer threw bits of sedum at the fish. He clutched the rock with both hands. "And what did your mother say?" he asked. "She sold me for $75. Philip shuddered. He turned and looked in Artemisia's face, to see perhaps if her story had left its traces there. She wanted $100. He offered $50. They came to terms for $75. Philip said nothing. He looked down into the bottle-green depths of the lake, and for some moments Artemisia was silent also. Presently, with a strange, forced voice, Philip asked, "How old were you when this transaction took place?" "Still a child. I traveled about with the red-bearded man, and he taught me to sing, trained me well, and at concerts made me sing, and I got great applause. I liked that. I was happier with him than at my mother's. I had no babies to carry about and to hush, none of the house drudging to do. Besides, he was kind, and he was an honorable man after his fashion. He treated me as if I were his daughter, and took immense pains to form me to be a public singer. But always the burden of his song was, 'See what you cost me, what trouble you give me.' Afterwards, when you are a finished artist, you must be engaged to me for a set of years, and repay me for my pains." I had not a word against that. I was quite aware that I was indebted to him, and I intended to show my gratitude by doing as he required. So I grew up going about with him, and he never allowed me to be treated with impertinence by any man. He always protected me, though not always in the most heroic manner. Once in California we were performing, he with his fiddle and me singing, at a liquor bar, when a half-tipsy gold-digger became offensively attentive to me. My master made me leave the place with him, and he ran away with me to San Francisco. I asked him why. He said that he must do that, or shoot or be shot by that fellow, and he had no wish for either. I remember sulking. I would have liked to see them fight about me. How long did you remain with this man? Till I was 18, and then, just as I was fit for something better, and to earn more money, my master spoiled his own game. How so? He wanted to marry me. I reckon he thought he could secure me best that way. If he had not asked me and himself pestered me about this, I would have stayed with him and let him have a share, a lion's share of my earnings. But he would not leave me in peace. He spoiled his own game by that and set me free. I left him. And then? Oh, I have been independent since then. I have sung in America, but I have met with most success in Germany. I go about where I will. I have no master. I earn enough to enable me out of the opera season to go to the mountains or the seaside. This is a dull spot, and I would not have made so long a stay in it had it not been that I was ordered to the elevated air here, because I had suffered from a relaxed or overstrained organ. Now you know my story. What do you think of it? Philip was watching her face, and feeling as if he received a shot in his heart every time she turned her splendid full eyes on him, and his hands trembled as they held the stone. Ever since I left my red-bearded master, I have been alone, alone in the world. I have had no one to whom to cling, no mind to which to go for advice in times of doubt and distress. Alone. Do you know what it is to be alone? Yes, said Philip, and he let sink his head on his breast, and looked down into the water. He also had spent a lonely youth, but in what opposite circumstances? You can have no idea, she continued, how I have longed, with agony of heart, for someone whose judgment I could trust, whose mind was superior, whose experience had been made in just those departments of life to which I am strange. I have longed for such an one, whom I could regard as a very dear friend, and to whom I could go in trouble and perplexity. But I have no one. For all these years I have been as much alone as the man in the moon. Philip put his hand to his collar. He tried to straighten the points, which had become limp. His hands shook so that he could do nothing with them. He was being burnt up, consumed by her eyes, which were on him, as she spoke of her desire to find a friend. Is it not strange, she said, that I, who have been preaching freedom, should feel the need of a bar? Not of many, but just one to hold by. Do you know what it is to stand at the verge of a precipice? To stand on a spire top where there is sheer abyss on every side? Can you imagine the giddiness, the despair that comes over one? My place is one surrounded by precipices, dangers everywhere. I see hands thrust out to give me the push to send me over, but not one, no, not one to hold me. You have mine, said Philip, and laid his on her wrist. She took his hand and pressed it thankfully. Now, she continued, you can understand what it must be to one on a dizzy peak or apex of a building, if there be a something, a bar even, to which to hold. Then the abysses below can be gazed into with impunity. Holding to that support, the dangers are no longer dreadful. There is no more fear of falling out of sheer desperation. She let go Philip's hand and stood up. It is time to return to our party. Oh, what a relief it has been to me to pour out my heart to you. And now, in return, tell me about Colonel Yao. The sound of that name at once brought Philip to his senses. He rose to his feet and stepped into the road. I am sorry to be unable to tell you about him, because I know little about him. As I said before, we belong to different spheres. They walked back together, talking of the weather and the mountains and flowers, and found the rest at a table. The restaurant was under repair, and no refreshments could be obtained there. Well, said Mrs. Sidebottom, you have kept us waiting a long time. We have been waiting for you, said Miss Durham. We thought you would come on to the head of the pass. Philip caught Salome's eye and avoided it. She looked wistfully, wonderingly at him. What did he mean by at one minute treating the American lady with coldness and rudeness, and then reversing his behavior towards her absolutely and at once? She took her husband's arm as they walked back to Andermatt. Philip was silent. He thought about the story he had heard of the loneliness of the poor girl who had confided her history to him. "What a long way this is, dear," said Philip. "It seems an age since we began the descent." End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 47. Edelweiss. Philip could not sleep during the night that followed the expedition to the Ober-Alp. His mind was occupied with what he had heard. He thought of the poor girl sold by her mother, of her rude apprenticeship, of the risks she had undergone, beautiful, young, attractive. He tossed in his bed. What would become of her? Could she stand exposed to the dangers that beset her and not, as she half threatened, throw herself over? What could be done for her? She had spoken of the freedom of her life as giving zest to existence. But too great freedom may pall. It had palled on the girl, and she had put up her hands, pleading to be fitted with light but strong manacles. What a contrast was to be found between his life and hers! He had been cramped and hedged about with restrictions. She had enjoyed an excess of liberty. Virtue, says Aristotle, is to be found in a happy medium, and not virtue only, but the plenitude and manifoldness of life can only unfurl itself in a happy medium between excess of freedom and oppressive restriction. Philip was and ever had been conscious that his abilities had not been allowed due expansion in the career into which he had been squeezed. And this American girl, with doubtless splendid capabilities of mind and heart, had allowed them to run riot and dissipate their fragrance in untutored independence. When she fixed her great dark eyes on him, what a thrill passed through him! And when she took his hand, fire ran up his veins and broke into a blaze in his heart. What could he do for her? How was it possible for him to assist her, to be to her the wise friend she desired? If he had made her acquaintance 2 years ago, it would have been another matter. He would have thrown himself at her feet, metaphorically of course, and asked her to take him as her guide, protector, and friend, to tie up her future with his, and so each would have contributed something to the other to make up what each lacked. Then what a different sort of life his would have been! His present mode of existence was similar, only better in quality, to that he had led before. One had been a sordid drudgery, the present was a gilded drudgery. The difference was in the adjective that qualified, not in the substance of which the stuff of his life was made up. He had now to devote the same attention to figures and technicalities and details as before. The figures, technicalities, details were formerly relative to conveyancing, they now concerned linen manufacture. Such acquaintances as he had formed at Nottingham had not been interested in much beyond their business, and the acquaintances he had formed at Murgatroyd had their interests concentrated on their business. Art, literature, science had been to those he knew at Nottingham, and were to those he knew at Murgatroyd, names, not ideas. Was life worth living in such surroundings, tied to such a routine? It is said that man, as he gets older, fossilizes. The currents of his blood choke the arteries, veins, vessels of heart and brain, till like furred water pipes and crusted boilers, they can no longer act. But was not the life to which he was condemned, with its monotony, its constraint, its isolation from the current of intellectual life, a mechanizing of man? Philip knew that he was losing, had lost, much of his individuality, almost all the spontaneity that had been lodged in him by the Creator, and was growing more and more into a machine, like his spinning jennies and steam looms. He thought of Salome. Had she many ideas outside the round of ordinary life? Was she not an ennobled, sweeter lodging-house keeper? She had been well educated, but her mind did not naturally soar into the ideal world. It went up spasmodically, like the grasshopper's, a little way, and was down on its feet again directly. She was interested in her baby, anxious to have her house neat, the cobwebs all away, the linen in perfect order, all the towels marked and numbered, the servants in thorough activity, the quotients for the cake and pudding measured in scales, not guessed. She was devoted to her flowers also. He recollected the hyacinths, and certainly they had filled his room with fragrance and anticipations of spring. But he had sent her to sleep by reading aloud Addison's Spectator, and when he tried Shakespeare, he found that she had no insight into the characters, and accepted the beauties rather than seized on them. What, Philip asked with a tremor, what if he had never met Salome and had met Artemisia? Then, indeed, he would have been transported on strong wings out of the world of commonplace and the sound of common talk and the murky atmosphere of vulgar interests, into a region where he would have shaken off his half-acquired habits of formality, his shyness, his cumbrousness and angularity, and become light-hearted, easy, and independent. In dreams we sometimes imagine ourselves to be flying. We rise from the ground and labor indefatigably with our arms as wings. And Philip was now dreaming, though not asleep, fancying that he could part with some of his gravity, and by an effort maintain himself in another sphere. He had missed his way in life. He was never designed to become a piece of clockwork, but to enjoy life, seize it with both hands, and hold it fast, and drink the mingled cup to the dregs, crowned with roses. Hitherto he had not suspected that the blood in his arteries was an effervescing wine. He had supposed it very still. What was to be done for Artemisia? It would be inhuman not to be reconciled with conscience, to turn away, to cast her off, when she entreated him to be her friend and help her with counsel. But how could he assist her? A drowning, despairing girl cried out for help. Could he suffer her to sink? Had he not promised her his assistance? "I am positively determined," said Mrs. Sidebottom next day, "that we shall go tomorrow to the hospice. I want to see it, and the dogs and the scenery. So I have ordered carriages, and what is more, we will stay there a day or two. Then such as like can descend the Val Tremola, and such as like can climb the Piso Central." "I have no objection," answered Salome. "We must not leave Andermatt until we have been over the pass, and seen the beauties or terrors of the further side. What do you say, Philip?" "I shall be glad." He stood up from the table. "Where are you going, Philip?" "To Miss Durham, to invite her to join us." "Of course," said Mrs. Sidebottom. "Let me see, we are 8. Oh, it won't matter, one of the girls can sit outside. The drivers always walk going uphill, so that there will be 5 in one carriage and 5 in the other. And Miss Durham will pay her share. Besides, if there is any climbing and excursioning to be done, she will pay half of a guide." But, strange caprice in Salome, she put her hand on Philip's arm and said in a low tone, "No, Philip, no." Philip looked at her with surprise. Why should she not wish the American lady to join the party? She was her friend. She had been so desirous that he and Miss Durham should conclude peace. And now that peace was agreed upon, Salome said no, Philip, no, when he proposed to invite the Chicago girl to join them. How capricious, how unreasonable Salome was! She forms a wish, he hastens to accord it, and lo, she hangs back and is dissatisfied. His aunt's favorite expression, fiddlestick ends, rose to his lips. He was not the man to be turned about by the wayward, unreasoned fancies of his wife. "Why not?" he asked. But Salome gave him no answer. She had formed no motive in her heart for asking him not to invite Miss Durham. She had not considered a reason. She reddened to the roots of her hair, but neither gave a reason nor repeated her request. There lingered all that day a little something, a dissonance of mood between Philip and Salome. Neither could account for it, and neither attempted to account for it. He was silent. He wandered about the hotel and the grounds, with a hope to light on Miss Durham. He did not go into the salle or on the terrace, into the reading room or about the garden, searching for her. He did not ask the waiters where she was, but he looked about wherever he went, expecting to see her, and when he found her not in the reading room or salle, on the terrace or in the garden, he felt that the place was uninteresting, and he must perforce go elsewhere. Salome was gentle, as usual, spending much time with her baby, showing it to those guests who were so gracious as to notice it, and smiling with pleasure when it was admired. But she was not herself, not as happy as she had been. Hitherto the only jar to her content was her husband's prejudice against Artemisia. Now the jar arose. She did not explain to herself how it arose, but she wished that Philip had not gone so far in his change of sentiment. Yet with her natural modesty and shrinking from casting blame, she reproached herself for grudging to her friend that friendship which she had herself invited Philip to bestow. The next day was lovely, with a cloudless sky, and the carriages departed. Some grumbling ensued and had to be resisted on the part of the drivers, because 5 persons were crammed into one carriage. Mrs. Sidebottom pointed out that the driver would walk. That was true, was the reply, but not till Hospenthal was reached. Moreover, the horses could not draw more than 4 up the St. Gothard road to the Hospice. There was still snow over a considerable tract. However, at length the difference was overcome by the promise of a small extra payment, 2½ francs extra, which threw such energy into the horses and so increased their power of traction that they consented for that price to draw 5 instead of 4 persons up the ascent from Hospenthal to the Hospice. In one carriage, that in front, sat Mrs. Sidebottom, Janet, and the captain, and one of the girls, the youngest. In the other carriage were Salome and Miss Durham, Philip, and the 2 other Labarte girls. But Philip did not remain long in it. At the steep ascent above the little picturesque cluster of houses, church, and castle that constitute Hospenthal, he got out and walked. The banks were overgrown with alpine rhododendron, as flames bursting out of the low olive-green bushes, and Philip hastened to pick bunches for the ladies. By a singular chance, the best flowers, and those best arranged, went to Miss Durham. "See there," said the driver, taking off his hat. "What is that?" "That is Edelweiss. You see?" He held his dirty brown cap to Philip, and showed him a tuft of white flowers, as though made out of wool. Philip had never seen the like before. "Are these found here, in these mountains?" "Jawohl." "Round here, up high, see?" The man pointed with his whip to the rocky heights. "She grow up very high. That flower you give to your loaf." "Loaf?" "Jawohl." The man winked, put his hand to his heart. "To your loaf, Schatz. You understand?" Philip flushed dark. He was hot with walking. "Let me have some of that flower. You shall have it back. No, thank you, not your hat." The man pulled the blossoms out from the dirty ribbon that retained them. "Dey is dry, but you should see when dey fresh." Philip took the little flowers to the side of the carriage. "Look at these," he said. "The man calls them, no, I cannot say the name." "Edelweiss," said Salome. "I have seen it dried in the shop windows. It is rare." "Edelweiss means the noble white flower," said Miss Durham. "It grows far from human habitation, and is much sought after. I have never found it myself, and never had any fresh picked given to me." "Would you like some?" asked Philip. "Very much indeed," answered Artemisia. "If it be possible to get any, you shall have it," he said. Then he walked on. The 4-carriage was stopped, and Mrs. Sidebottom was descending with Claudine Labarte, whom she had persuaded to get out with her and pick flowers, thus leaving the captain and Janet by themselves. "Before long," said Mrs. Sidebottom, "we shall be beyond the line where flowers grow, so we must make the best of our opportunity now, Miss Labarte." Then Mrs. Sidebottom fell back to where Philip was, and took his arm and pressed it, looked up at him humorously, and said, "I have a bit of news to tell you. He is going to propose. That is why I have got Felicity out of the carriage." "Who, Lambert?" "Lambert, of course, not the driver. And to Janet. Have you not seen it coming?" "But perhaps she will not have him." "Fiddlestick ends! Of course she will. Don't you see that she likes him and has been drawing him on? Besides, I have sounded her. The only difficulty is about Salome." "How can she be a difficulty?" "Oh, she may think it too soon for them to get married when Mrs. Cusworth died so recently." "Then they can postpone the marriage." "Fiddle faddle, of course not. Always strike whilst the iron is hot. That is Edelweiss in your hand, is it? Oh, could you manage to find or get a man to find some quite fresh for Lambert to present to Janet? It is the correct thing in the Alps, the graceful accompaniment of a declaration." "I will try to get some," said Philip. "Lambert, you see, will be too much engaged with Janet to go far himself. Besides, he is not able to take great exertion. Climbing has a deteriorating effect on the trouser knees. It makes them baggy. You will get him some?" "I will go searching for Edelweiss when we reach the hospice," said Philip. To himself he muttered, "But not for Lambert and Janet." End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 48. Trapped. For the last hour of the ascent, the carriages passed through snow, not continuous, but between walls cut in the avalanches and drifts that had formed in the basins. The air was cold. The ground was so wet through melted snow that Philip and Mrs. Sidebottom and Mademoiselle Labarte were obliged to ride. The walls of snow had fallen in here and there, so that the horses were obliged to flounder through. The scenery was bleak and wintry. The ladies shivered. At length the lake was reached in which the Reuss had its source, and a little beyond it the roofs of the hospice and the inn were visible. In 10 minutes the shivering party was assembled in the salle à manger, which was heated, and was ordering dinner. The monks had been banished for many years, and the hospice let by the canton of Tessen to an innkeeper of Airolo, who, with his worthy wife and family, have been in no way inferior in hospitality, in care for the poor travellers, and in providing for the comforts of the rich than were the brothers of old. Signora Lombardi, stout, hale, and smiling, was in the hospice, exerting all her energies to get food ready for the large party that had come in. Wines, the best of North Italy, were to be had, and veal in various forms, but always veal, call it what you will. "Oh, my goodness gracious me!" cried Mrs. Sidebottom. "There is a dog, a Mount St. Bernard dog. Oh, the size, the beauty! It must become the rage. Why, I have heard of more than £200 being given for a tulip, and what would not be given for such a dog as this, and with pulmonary complaint too that develops on the plains." "You do not mean to say, aunt, that you are going to invest in shares in the Beeple Yao dog breeding establishment," said Philip satirically. "Colonel Yao are you speaking about?" interrupted Miss Durham eagerly. "Do tell me, do you think he will establish his claims to the title of Schofield?" "He can establish his title to that name whenever he pleases," said Philip. "And once more, if you have any regard for our feelings, you will not mention that person again in our hearing. Oh, here, in this glass on the table, are some draggled specimens of the white fluffy flower you call Edelweiss. Perhaps our landlady, Signora Lombardi, will tell us if it grew near this inn." "Oh, signor," answered the stout woman, "it is to be found by the searchers, but I have never discovered it. I am too fat to climb, and besides, my day for Edelweiss is over." She laughed and shook her sides as though she had made a good joke. "I leave the Edelweiss to the young people." Her eye rested with a sly twinkle, first on the captain and Janet, about whom there could be no doubt, and then on Philip and— her eye hesitated a moment between Salome and Artemisia, and then rested on the latter. Philip looked uneasily out of the little window at the bleak outer world. When dinner was finished, the afternoon was advanced. Philip went out in front of the inn, on the platform of rock upon which it is built. Some of the ladies talked of taking a stroll to the head of the Val Tremola, but determined not to go far. They would reserve their strength for the ensuing day. He did not volunteer to accompany them. He had another scheme in his head. Outside the inn was a guide lounging about, smoking and calling to such as passed in the road. Philip signed to him that he desired to speak to him, and the man came to him with alacrity, but shook his head and pointed to one of the snow peaks. He could speak only Italian, and Philip only English. They were obliged to converse in dumb show. Philip showed him the flower of Edelweiss he had brought from the glass on the table inside. The man nodded his head. Philip raised his eyebrows in note of query and pointed to the rocks around. "See, see," answered the man, shaking his head like a poised China mandarin. "All about there? Anywhere?" asked Philip, speaking very loud, as though by loudness he could make the man comprehend. "Oh, if it is anywhere, I can find it easily." The man shook his head and again pointed to a snow peak over which a film of cloud was forming, then being blown away, then forming again. "Do you mean that it is not out there?" asked Philip. "I knew that as well as you. There are only ice and snow yonder." Bless my soul, what idiots these men are! Then he went back into the inn to equip himself with gaiters and strong boots, and to fetch his stick, with a chamois horn for a handle, that he had bought. Whilst he was engaged fastening his leggings, he heard the voices of the young ladies outside the house. They were starting for a walk. Presently he descended from his room and studied the map of the district suspended in the salle till he thought he had it well impressed on his brain, after which he sallied forth. The guide was no longer outside. The afternoon was verging to a close, and no one would be likely to require his services, he supposed. Consequently, he had retired to the lower room of the hospice on a level with the road, where the drivers and carriers, the guides and peasants were regaled with sour wine. Philip was relieved to see that the fellow was no longer there. He might have wanted to come with him and show him the way, and it would have been irksome to trudge beside a man with whom it was not possible to converse. Besides, Edelweiss was to be found everywhere, Madame Lombardi had said, if looked for on the rocks. Those guides made difficulties about finding it, so as to induce the uninitiated and easily persuaded to engage them to direct them to spots where it grew. Philip resolved to go by himself. He would not go far. He could not lose his way. There were no yawning chasms down which he might tumble that he could see, and avalanches, he was told, fell in the early spring. He must do some climbing, of course, because the tourists would have picked all the Edelweiss within reach on both sides of the road, and he must scramble to places they had not ransacked. But he would not go into any danger. He would keep his eye on the hospice, or at least the road. Along the road he trudged in his heavy boots till he came to a great weather-beaten crucifix that marked the beginning of the descent on the Italian side. The cross was painted dull red, but the paint had peeled away in patches, blistered by frost or sun. Philip looked up wonderingly at it. How out of place it seemed there, in that wilderness of bare rock and pure snow. He seemed to be in the midst of a primeval world, which had not yet begun to produce green trees and herbs, the foul and living beasts. All around was utter silence. The world around was lifeless. The sun was behind the great wall of snowy glacier mountains, and the vapor that was collected like smoke on its head, so that the prospect seemed to be that of a world such as existed when there was light, but the sun was uncreate. And in the center of this inchoate, unvitalized world stood the crucifix. The mountains looked down on it, the glaciers frowned on it as a thing of today, as though they said, "We were before ever you were dreamed of, and we shall be long after mankind has ceased to believe in self-devotion, and has come to laugh at every creed save the idolatry of self." Then Philip diverged from the road and began to climb. There was a valley opening here from the highest peaks, down which a little rill fell, and on the flank of the mountain which faced the south there was comparatively little snow, and Philip saw tracts of moss and herbage. That would be the garden of the Edelweiss. There he must search, and he would find the desired flower without serious trouble. He was surprised to find the distances greater than they appeared. In that highly rarefied and clear air, things far off appeared close, and dimensions as well as distances were deceptive. He found green carpets of dwarf campion studded with pink flower, dense as moss, and in the bogs soldanella shaking their delicately fringed purple bells, but no Edelweiss. Disappointed in his search on the slope which had promised, he crossed the brook and crept along the flank of the opposite mountain. He would turn its shoulder and get to the side well exposed to the sun. That which he had just explored was, he now perceived, shut off from all but vertical rays by the mountain ridge south of it. He groped and scrambled, turned back, went higher, had long lost sight of the hospice, had not indeed remembered to look for it, when suddenly he was enveloped in dense white fog. He could, however, see the sun through it like a copper ball, but only for a minute, and then it sank behind a ridge. At least so he supposed, for it was extinguished gradually. He must now retrace his steps. He dare not advance. He thought he could find his way back. He remembered several landmarks, a rock on top of which was some dwarf shrub, like a wig worn by an old fellow he knew at Nottingham, and a furrow which, if he followed it, must lead him to the brook. But he soon found that he had lost all sense of direction. The disappearance of the sun had taken from him the only clue as to the points of the compass. He was hot. He sat down for a moment and wiped his face. The water was streaming off it. He was not as yet alarmed, only vexed especially at his having made this expedition in vain. He would have to return without the Edelweiss. "That is old Jarvis's head with the wig thrust back," he said, as a nodule of rolled rock appeared through the mist. But when he took a second look at it, he doubted. "I wish I had brought a whiskey flask with me," he muttered. "I'm beginning to feel an ache in my muscles." He stumbled on, and now, to his alarm, saw that the darkness was closing in rapidly. He had not considered, when he started, that in the south of Europe there is no twilight, and that night comes after day without hours of grace. Now it flashed upon him that what the guide had meant when indicating the mountain top wreathed in vapor was, not that Edelweiss grew there, but that the weather was going to change, or the fog to descend. He hurried on, but did not know in which direction he was going. He was on a steep slope of snow that stretched before him apparently interminably, lost itself in vapor, and curled over and enveloped him as in an apple pie bed, a cold sheet of white below, before, above, behind. And at that moment he saw on the rock above him, almost within reach, the white starry nodding head of an Edelweiss. The woolly flower was burdened with the moisture that had condensed on it from the fog, and was hanging over the stone to shake itself free. With an exclamation of satisfaction, Philip sprang up the slope, caught the rock with the hook of his stick, and tore the Edelweiss away. Had the crook of his stick been what it professed to be, a chamois horn, he would have been safe. It would have sustained his weight. But as it was only bone, and the curve came across the grain, it snapped, and Philip shot down the snowy declivity. He still grasped the tuft of Edelweiss. He thrust his stick into the snow to arrest his descent. He tore up the snow, twisted the stick in his hand, and shot further down, shot instantaneously out of the fog into dusk, in which everything was distinct, and below he saw a great sweep of snow like a sheet. He looked into it as Sancho Panza into that in which he was being tossed. He drove his heels into the snow, his elbows, his stick, to retard his descent, and suddenly dropped. Then found himself on rubble, still sliding, and brought up with a jerk by a rock. For a few minutes Philip was unconscious. He was aware of a shock, a slide, darkness, and noise. That was all. But where was he? He had vanished from the face of the earth, gone through the surface of snow into a depth beneath. A field of snow had filled the bottom of a valley, and a river ran beneath in a ravine. Nothing could be seen of the cleft, nothing of the river. The smooth sheet of snow hid both. But the force of Philip's descent had broken through that portion of the covering where it was thinnest, near the rock and rubble. He had gone through and was buried alive. Beneath him, about him, was darkness, pitch darkness. Only above could he see the hole through which he had fallen, looking like a silver-gray disk. The air about him was filled with thunder, the pulsating thunder such as he had heard at the fall of the Reuss at the Devil's Bridge, such as he had heard that very day where the river plunged over a wall of rock in the gorge above Hospenthal. The air, moreover, was as full of water here beneath as it had been above in the fog, but the particles here were much larger. This was the spray cast up by the raging, leaping, headlong water in the abyss. How far down was it to that torrent? Eye could not penetrate, ear could not tell. The vault of snow overhead reverberated with the boom of the water and cast it back into the gulf as it cast back the upthrown spray. He could see no water. He could see nothing save the gap overhead. What was he to do? His arms were heavy and numbed with cold. He cautiously lifted one and found that the snow had been driven, even rammed, hard up the sleeve by his descent. He was safe where he lodged, on rock, and he shook out the snow from one sleeve and then the other. In doing this he found the bunch of Edelweiss. He did not see it. He felt it up his sleeve. It had been carried there by the snow. He did not throw it away. He left it where it was. What was he to do? His situation was precarious. He might turn giddy and fall over. That terrible fascination there is in an abyss might lay hold of him and draw him down. Artemisia had spoken of that fascination, the fascination of despair. Now he felt it. He tried to scramble up, but the shale slipped away beneath his feet, and he was fain, in an agony of terror, to recover his former place on firm rock. It was not practicable to ascend. He leaned back against the stones that dripped and ran with water, the melting of the snow overhead, the condensation of the foam from the river beneath. The water condensed also on his forehead and ran off his brows, water cold as ice. Where his fingers worked hollows in the loose soil, the water settled, and soaked his fingers and turned them dead with cold. Was it that there was rhythm in the fall of the water, or was it that his pulses beat in his ear and gave rhythm to the continuous thunder? He could not tell. He heard the throb of sound, or it seemed to him to be the rattle of the machinery of his mill at Murgatroyd multiplied to infinity. His feet had glowed with the exercise, but now they began gradually to lose heat and turn stone cold. In time they would cease to have feeling in them. Then in numbness and weariness his knees would buckle under him, and he would shoot headlong like a diver into the black void. How far down was it to the water, to death, he wondered. Would he feel, be conscious of the shock over the edge before he went into the water, or crash with his head against a rock? He had heard a fellow clerk say that as he was drowning, the whole of his past life rushed before his eyes, and spread itself out as a panorama, a succession of scenes, in a moment of time. 20 years unfolded leisurely in 1 second, displaying every incident, not crowded but in sequence, and all articulate. Would it be so as he went over the edge, in the span of time between the rocks on which he stood and the clash and extinction below? His heart grew faint, and he felt in him the qualm that a bad sailor knows as the vessel plunges into a deep sea trough. But surely he would be sought by the people at the inn. Certainly he would be sought, but in what direction would they look for him? How trace him in the mist? How suppose he was below the surface of the smooth quilt of snow in the Val Tremola, sunk out of sight, hanging over a boiling torrent? And now down past Philip ran a thread of silver. It startled him, and he looked up the line to see a glimpse of the moon appear above the hole through which he had fallen. The fog must have cleared away, or be clinging partially to certain mountain tops. If the moon were clear, then the search for him could be prosecuted with some chance of success. But Philip was not overconfident. His powers of endurance were ebbing. He raised his feet and stamped on the rock. He could feel the shock in his joints, but not in his feet. They were dead. His hands were stiff. He put his fingers into his mouth, but this only momentarily restored vitality. After the feeling had gone, the muscular power would become paralyzed. He was not hungry, but squeamish. He looked again at the moon, and continued watching it eagerly. It slid forward and shone full through the window of his dungeon. The light fell on rocky point and rill of leaping water, but could not illumine the abyss below, out of which rose the voices and thunderings, the voices of death, the thunderings preceding judgment. And now the white ray of the moon smote down into the gulf below his feet, and disclosed a shoot of the purest, most sparkling silver, the leaping torrent as it danced over a ledge into utter darkness, into which no moonray could dive. Suddenly from above a mass of snow detached itself and fell past him, a mass so big that had it smitten him it would have carried him down with it. The side of the hole in the snow dome grazed the moon and ate more and still more out of it. Philip looked with fear. He felt that when the whole of the moon had passed beyond that opening, and not another ray fell into it, when again the darkness of that vault would become utter, hope would die away from his heart, and he must fall. But as he stood looking up, watching the slipping away of the moon, he saw sharp cut against it a black something, and heard above the roar of the water the discordant sounds of a bark. He was found by one of the Hospice dogs. The first giddiness of renewed hope almost overcame him. He trembled as in a fit, and his knees bent so that only by a supreme effort of the will could he brace them again. He believed he heard shouts, but was uncertain. What followed remained ever after confused in his memory. He heard some Italian words in his ear, saw or felt someone by him, was grasped, a rope fastened round him. He heard himself encouraged to make an effort, tried to scramble, helped by the rope, broke through the snow and was in the upper world again, was surrounded, had brandy poured down his throat. Then he was seized by the hand and shaken. "Old fellow! Phil! 'Pon my word, you have given us a turn. We have been hunting you everywhere." "Lambert!" "Yes, Phil. And who'd have thought to find you trapped under the snow?" The men of the party urged immediate movement to restore circulation. Philip's hand, when dropped by Lambert, was seized again and held tightly, but he had lost feeling in it. Nor could he see clearly. He was dazzled by the light, the brilliance of the moon and the glare of the snow, after the darkness below. "Who is that laughing?" he asked suddenly. "Oh, Miss Durham," answered Lambert. "And who is that crying?" A whisper in his ear. "It is I, Salome." End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 49. Têtê-à-Têtê. Philip passed a night of pain and fever. He was bruised and shaken. His hands had been scarified in the slide down the rubble, and when circulation returned in them, they bled. The exposure to cold had affected him, and he ached in every joint. His skin was as though red-hot plates had been passed over it. He could not sleep, for if he dropped out of consciousness, it was into mental fear that he was falling down a precipice into the vortex of an unseen torrent, and he woke with a start that sent a thrill of torture through his strained nerves. He could not get the roar of the water out of his ears. He had carried it away with him in his head. Salome, at his request, to dispel it, played the jingling piano in the salle beneath his room, but that was powerless to dissipate it. Then he sent his request to Miss Durham to sing. Perhaps her splendid voice might drive away the delusion. Her answer was that she had no voice. No voice! He knew that she had boasted to him of it. He sent another message. Then came back the reply that she could not and would not sing to such a detestable little instrument as that in the salle. Next day Philip was obliged to keep his bed. He was in discomfort and pain, and not the best of tempers. "Salome," said he, when his wife came to him with her fresh, bright face full of sympathy and cheering, "thank you for going on playing on the piano yesterday evening. Whilst you played I could forget the roar, but it returned directly that your fingers left the keys. I take it most unkind of Miss Durham that she would not sing." "Oh, Philip, don't you know that she has come to the high mountains to husband her voice? And it is possible that to sing at this great altitude, we are nearly 7,000 feet above the sea, might do it serious injury." "Why did she laugh when I was drawn out of the chasm?" "Philip, dear, I cannot tell, but neither she nor I had any idea of the danger you had been in. The ravine was completely blocked up and sheeted over with snow, and we did not know anything of the horrible chasm down which the river plunged and through which it struggled. We only knew that you had gone through a crust of snow, and that you had to be drawn out." "But did you not hear the thunder of the torrent?" "We did not particularly notice it. The roof of snow muffled it. You, who were beneath, heard it, but we may have heard something, but had no more idea of what there was beneath than you can have had when you slipped through." It was very unfeeling of her to laugh. "Look here, Philip," said Salome. "In turning the sleeves of your coat inside out, I have found these flowers, Edelweiss, and fresh." "Yes, I found them." He considered for a moment, and then said, "They are for you. Wear them, and let our party know that I did not encounter the risks I passed through without bringing back with me a prize." "Thank you, dear Philip." She stooped over him and kissed his lips. "Dear, dear Philip, I shall never part with them. It was most kind of you, and brave, too, to go in search of them for me." "Salome," said he, "don't let Lambert, and above all, Mrs. Sidebottom, come and worry me today. I am in horrible pain. I cannot move, and I cannot bear to be bothered. You go down and take a short stroll. Do not mind about me. I will try to doze. I had no sleep last night. I am turning all the colors of the rainbow, I was so bruised. I shall be right in a day or two. No bones are broken, but I cannot stir and cannot endure to be worried. Let me be quiet and a good deal to myself. I will sleep when I can." "May I sit by you a little?" she asked timidly. "I will not speak, only hold your hand." She took his silence for consent, and he found comfort in her presence. A soothing feeling crept up his arm from her hands that clasped his, and spread over his heart. He was somewhat ashamed of himself. He had not made his expedition among the rocks, and met with his fall, in searching for Edelweiss for her, but for Artemisia. Salome had accepted the flower, and cherished it as if he had sought it for her, and he allowed her to remain in this delusion. Was this honorable? Was it in accordance with that strict rectitude on which he plumed himself? Yet he could not tell her the truth. It would wound her too deeply, and humble himself too considerably. 2 days ago Artemisia Durham had taken his hand on the Ober-Alp beside the lake, when he extended it to her in pledge that he would do great things for her. And now, in redemption of his pledge, he had tried to get her a bit of Edelweiss, and had tumbled through the snow in his efforts. And what could he do for her? She had not asked for legal advice, or for figured table linen, the 2 things he could furnish her with without offense. It was as well that his hand was hurt. It served him right. He had no right to offer what he was unable to perform. How differently he had felt as Artemisia held his hand! Then an intoxicating current had set boiling through his veins, turning his head, maddening him. Now the cool hand of Salome conveyed balm to his aching joints. And what was a better medicine, though a bitter one, self-reproach to his conscience. Now also, for the first time since his walk with Miss Durham, some of the old suspicion oozed up through the joints of his thoughts. What was the reason of her laughter? Thrice it had occurred. First she had said something laughingly about him to Beeple-Yow at table, and provoked that odious creature to an explosion of laughter. Then, on the Ober-Alp pass, she had laughed for no particular reason that Philip could see, and had made Philip laugh with her. And lastly, she had laughed mockingly, alone, when he was rescued from the very verge of a dreadful death. He shut his eyes and lay still. Salome sat by him for an hour, and then, thinking he was asleep, released his hand, kissed him quietly, and stole from the room. Mrs. Sidebottom wanted to take a short walk. It was tedious in the inn, with only a few old and odd volumes of Tauchnitz novels about, and cold or inactivity was rendering the Labarte girls torpid, and they were clinging about Aunt Janet, or dropping upon her at embarrassing times. Mrs. Sidebottom did not feel equal to managing all three unaided, and as Miss Durham declined to accompany her, she insisted on Salome lending her aid. Salome consented. Her husband had wished that she should go out, and he was asleep and could be left without anxiety. The girls had been shown at Andermatt beads and seals made of a sparkling stone, which was said to be found on the St. Gothard road, halfway down the Val Tremola, and when Mrs. Sidebottom proposed a walk, they entreated to be allowed to search for this precious stone, of which they resolved to compose necklaces for themselves, or at least bracelets. It would create quite a sensation at Elbeuf. Not one of the girls there had seen this beautiful stone. Not one, probably, had heard the name of tremoline, by which it was called. There was another reason why Mrs. Sidebottom, on this occasion, particularly desired the companionship of Salome. She was commissioned to break to her the news that Janet and Lambert were engaged, and to use her endeavours to overcome any prejudice Salome might entertain against the marriage being solemnized shortly at Bern at the embassy. And Mrs. Sidebottom was about to attack her on this point by representing that she, Salome, was not the person to make objections, when she herself had married Philip within a very short time of the supposed death of Uncle Jeremiah, who, though he was not her father, had stood to her much in the light of a parent. Salome had observed that Janet and the captain took much delight in each other's society, but she had not given their association a serious thought. She knew that her sister liked lively society, and the captain had exhibited, whilst at Andermatt, an amount of vivacity and humour which she had not given him the credit of possessing. They were both interested in things of which she knew nothing, and naturally, therefore, sought each other's society. They were also connections in a roundabout fashion. Through Philip, Lambert became her cousin, and as Janet was her sister, he must be some sort of cousin to Janet, quite near enough relation to remove starchness of intercourse, and place them on easy terms of cousinly association, that excused a good deal which would be inadmissible were they unrelated. Philip heard the voices of the party outside the house, the crisp laughter of the girls and the sawing tones of Mrs. Sidebottom, and then the sounds became distant and ceased. His meditations were interrupted about a quarter of an hour later by 3 raps against the wall by his head. The several rooms in the inn were small, and divided from each other and from the passage by wood, not very thick deal boarding, papered over, but which, in places, had warped and split the paper. Signora Lombardi, every spring with a pot of paste and some strips of paper, went about the rooms, pasting over the rifts, disguising them, and preventing the partitions from being as diaphanous as they were diaphanous. German, Swiss, and Italian beds are wooden boxes, narrow and short, and in such a bed, against such a wall, lay Philip, unable to move without torture. Again 3 loud raps. "Who is that?" he called. "Are you awake, Mr. Pennycomequick?" asked the voice of Miss Durham, almost in his ear. "We are in adjoining stalls. I want a word with you because I leave this insufferable place tomorrow." I can endure the cold and tedium no longer, and before you return to the nether world, I may be away, unless you descend in a glissade, and shoot through the roof of the Hotel Imperial upon us into the midst of the table at dinner." Philip felt the partition between them shake. She was laughing. She had her chair against it and leaned against it to speak to him and to laugh at him. "I must ask your pardon," she said presently, with a twitter in her tones from suppressed merriment. "I did not realize your danger, or rather the danger you had escaped, when pulled out of the snow. But my laughter was excusable. You can have no conception how infinitely comic an object you presented, and the whole affair was so ridiculous. You going aloft after Edelweiss, without the smallest acquaintance with its habitat, and with no experience to teach you how to keep your footing in alpine altitudes, and shooting down, pop, through a hole into the nether world, and then to see the men about the hole extracting you. It was like Eskimo fishing." Philip was not only vastly offended, but he was also greatly shocked at the conduct of the young Chicago lady, holding a conversation with him through the wall when he was in bed. To show his sense of the indelicacy of her course, he said nothing in return. She tapped again. "Well, Mr. Pennycomequick, have I scandalized you? We are in the land of freedom, and I am daughter of the Stars and Stripes, and we American girls are not so particular about trifles as are your English misses. Are you very much bruised and crumpled?" "Very," groaned Philip. "Do you good. Take some of the starch out of you. You had the temerity to browbeat and insult me when first you came to Andermatt. Now I have served you out, and I may tell you this to your consolation, that it is a lucky thing for you that you had your fall and contusions. But for that I would have turned you inside out and twisted your silly head off your shoulders. I intended to do it, for no man offends me and escapes stings. I am content to leave you as you are, black and blue and disjointed, like a wretch on the rack." She was stretching his mind on the rack, and disjointing that as well, sitting leaning against the wall and working the mechanism. "Mr. Pennycomequick, I heard about you from your wife before you arrived. How different you proved to the idea I had formed. You have too much conceit to imagine. I found a wooden man, with his limbs affixed to his trunk by pegs, with a wooden face, wooden ideas, wooden manners, and when this wooden figurehead had the audacity to insult me—" Philip exclaimed, "What I said was true. You yourself admitted its truth when you told me your story." "My dear dolt," said Miss Durham, "I admit it, but who likes to have the truth skewered on a bayonet and rammed down his throat? And now what I say would splutter about like Japanese fireworks and do no one any harm, were it not that it is true, true in every word, and this it is that turns each word into duckshot with which I pepper you through the wall." It was a wonder that next day Signora Lombardi did not find the sheets of number 18 singed. So hot did Philip become between them with offended modesty, with anger, anguish, and shame. "The game is up, so I do not mind showing you my hand," cried Artemisia. She had folded her arms over her breast and leaned back with her head against the wall and talked hastily, passionately. "That little wife of yours, who is 1,000 times too good for you, and whom I pity, yoked to such a fellow as yourself, she told me that it was not possible for you to come to love me, because she was your wife. Not," she hastened to explain, "that she esteemed herself irresistible and very superior, but because she had such a towering opinion of your rectitude, equal to your own of yourself. That was as much as daring me to attempt the conquest. And your own absurd self-esteem was another provocation. When you threw down the glove, I accepted the challenge, and you know how in an hour or two I had spun you around like a teetotum." She stayed talking to laugh. As she laughed, she shook the wall, and the wall rattled Philip's bed, and the rattling bed rattled his aching joints. but he felt these pains no more in the intensity of the agony of shame that he endured in his racked mind. "You were quite fetching," she continued, "when you held out your hand and offered to be my stay. I was obliged to jump up. With all my powers of self-control, I could hardly keep from boxing your ears and sending you into the lake for your impudence. However, I had no wish that the transformation scene should come off too soon. I intended to lead you on through other follies till I had ruined your reputation and your self-respect. But the fates have been against me. I cannot wait longer here. I abandon you to yourself and to your good little wife. I cannot waste time over you. I have other matters to attend to, better game to pursue than such a wooden leaping frog as you." She stood up from her chair and went to the window. It commanded a bleak prospect. She could not see the returning party on it. The girls Labarty had perhaps found the desired minerals, and would not desist from collecting till they had each enough to form a parure of tremoline. Artemisia returned to her seat against the wall, and said, "As for that romance I told you about myself, believe of it as much or as little as you please. When you tell your own story with your autobiography, the little episode of Artemisia Durham will not be found in it. We only remember and write of ourselves as we would like others to know us, not as we are. Is it not so?" Then suddenly she broke into a song, a popular Viennese opera air, which she had turned into rough English verse to enable her to sing it at concerts elsewhere than in Germany. She had a beautiful, a naturally flexible voice, and every note was like an articulate crystal drop. "A little grain of falsehood is found in all that's said. It penetrates as leaven, whatever's uttered. No man is what he seemeth, no woman what appears. There's falsehood oft in laughter, and falsehood in tears. Both fact and fib together go in everything we say or do. To a peck of truth, a pinch of lie, as the spice in the pudding to qualify." End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 50. In the Hospice. There is a toy, the delight of children, that consists in a mannikin, with his legs curled under him, weighted with lead in his globular nether parts. This mannikin, however persistently held down or violently knocked over, always rights himself. And there are human beings similarly constituted. With them, self-conceit supplies the place of lead. There is no disturbing their equilibrium for more than a moment. Lay their heads in the dust, and the instant the finger that depressed them is removed, up go the heads again, nose in air. Strike them with horsewhip or poker, and they shiver in mute anger, unconscious of humiliation, and they are steady again, nose in air. Bore holes in them, and you cannot let out their ponderosity and disturb their equilibrium. Set them on the fire, and you cannot melt the self-conceit out of them. It oozes out of their pores, it distills from their fingertips, it streams out of their eyes, it pours from their lips, and yet never exhausts itself, any more than the oil in the cruse of the widow of Sarepta. Kick them, and they travel upright, nose in air, along the carpet. Pitch them out of the window, and they go down head uppermost. Sink them in the deepest well, and they sit slowly disintegrating at the bottom, head up. Philip was not one of these. It was true that in him was a large amount of self-esteem, or what religious people would call self-righteousness, but it was not an organic inbred quality. It had been developed by his education, by the circumstances of his early life, and could therefore be expelled from his system by sharp medicine. by one of those exquisitely pitiful provisions of nature which compensates to the nightingale for his plainness by giving him a tuneful voice, and to the peacock for his harsh notes by surrounding him with a glory of gold and green, men of little acquirements, little minds, little presence, are furnished with the blessed gift of bumptiousness, which makes them unconscious of their insignificance, which induces those who can by no probability be heroes to others, to be heroes to themselves. Just as the most ignorant men are the most positive, so are the most empty men the most self-contained. They can blow themselves out with a breath of their own nostrils. Success in life is not necessary to make a man conceited, nor beauty to superinduce vanity in a woman. The extravagances of conceit are found in those men who have made a botch of life, and of vanity in those women who have least personal charms. Every disappointment, every rebuff, throws them in on themselves, and they seek in themselves that approval and appreciation which is denied them without. Like Narcissus, but lacking his excuse, they fall in love with themselves because no one else will love them. Is it not possible that appreciation may be an element as necessary to the psychical as oxygen is necessary to the physical life? That when it is not freely given or wrested from the world without, we may set to work to engender it for ourselves within, just as in Jules Verne's romance, those who voyaged 10,000 leagues under the sea, being out of the element that naturally fed the lungs, manufactured it for themselves under water. Had Philip been constitutionally conceited, had bumptiousness been congenital, like scrofula in the blood, or tubercle in the brain, the overthrow he had met with at the hands of Miss Durham would not have seriously affected him, would have had no educative effect on him. He would have sighed and resigned himself to the conviction that Miss Durham was to be pitied, not he, because an inscrutable providence, which denies to some eyes the faculty of seeing color, and to some ears the power to distinguish and enjoy melodies, and to some noses the capacity to delight in odors, had denied to Miss Durham the ability to admire and adore him. In the classic tale, Achilles was plunged by his mother Thetis into the waters of Styx, which made him invulnerable, save in the heel by which she held him. So our good Mother Nature takes some of her children, not the robust of brain, and the Achillean in vigor and beauty, and renders them callous, so that they can pass through life unhurt by shaft of ridicule, scourge of rebuke, and flout of fortune. Every arrow glances off their skin, every blade used on them has its edge turned, every cudgel breaks without bruising. What happiness is theirs! They are whole and unhurt, whereas their richer endowed brothers are hacked and pierced and heartbroken. The author had once to do with a worthy, pious man, put in a situation under him, who was triple panoplied in the hide of self-esteem. As is usual with such persons, he was not much short of a fool, and did very foolish, inconsiderate things. When called to task for some egregious act, he bore the reprimand with meekness, then retired to his closet, where he prayed for him who had rebuked him, as for a persecutor. Never for one particle of a moment did it occur to him that he himself deserved blame. And the author knows full well that the callous-skinned who read these pages will feel no cut from his words, but draw up their heels under them, out of the way of his scythe. It has been proved by experiment that the tortoise can live though deprived of its brains, but the tortoise is the animal with the hardest epidermis known. Perhaps the converse may be true, that those animals with the largest proportion of brain may have the most sensitive skins. Now Philip was no fool. He had plenty of sound sense, but his moral faculties had been warped by the circumstances of his early career, and he had grown up with great suspicion of others, but sure confidence in himself. Now suddenly his eyes had been opened by a rude shock. His moral nature had been subjected to a glissade and a jolt almost as severe as that which his body had undergone. And as he was not tough and horny-hided in mind, he felt the results as acutely. If he ached with bruises and sprains in flesh and sinew, so did he ache with bruise and sprain in all the tissues and fibers of his inner spiritual self. When Salome returned to Philip's room, she found him disinclined to talk. He was still twitching and quivering from the lashes he had received, conscious only of his present pain, covered with humiliation. He had not been given time to think of his future conduct, even to consider the retrospect. The present torture occupied and made to tingle every nerve of his soul. With the innate tact which Salome possessed, she saw at once that he did not wish to be disturbed, though she could not divine that he had other cause for suffering than his fall, or that other injuries had been done him than those which made his body black and blue. She knew that he was in pain, and that he sought to disguise the fact from her, and though full of solicitude for him, she did not harass him with attentions. She drew a little stool beside his bed and seated herself on it, with needlework for the baby, and did not look at him. He lay on his back, but turned his head and saw her beautiful auburn hair, with the evening sun tinging it with orange fire. For some time he looked at it without thought of her, only of himself, his shame, his jarred self-respect. That jest of Artemisia about the Eskimo watching about a hole in the ice to pull out of it a fish was present to him. He saw the fish come up flapping its tail and tossing to escape the barb, and then thought of himself being hauled out of the hole in the snow through which he had plunged. Then he considered how that she, this malicious woman, had held him with a hook in his jaws, and had played with him. And then how he had been suddenly plunged out of a world of light and smoothness into an abyss where all was darkness and horror. Where was he? Into what had he fallen? Had he not almost shot over the precipice and gone down into the uttermost depths of degradation? What if this accident had not befallen him? What if that woman had gone on playing with him, and had lured him further, as in the folk tales the nixies of the waterfalls lure shepherds to throw themselves over, with the vain belief that by doing so they will fall into the arms and be received into the realm of the water sprites? His ideas became confused. At one moment he was a fish caught by a barb, then he was clinging to a rock, withdrawing from the enticements of a siren. The sun had set, or no longer crowned Salome with fire. She continued her needlework till dusk closed in rapidly and prevented her seeing her stitches, but she sat on, upon her little stool, resting her cheek against the bedclothes. Philip, half dreaming, had caught a lock of her hair and twisted it round his finger, and held it as if it were something that was so firm, so sure, that if he clung to it, if he would retain it about his finger as a golden hoop, he could not continue his slide and fall. And so thinking or fancying, in a confused condition of mind, bred of or fostered by pain and shame, he had fallen asleep. Salome sat on, did not venture to move her head lest she should disturb his sleep by withdrawing her hair from his fingers. Next morning Mrs. Sidebottom, Miss Durham, Mrs. Baines, and the Labarte girls, together with the captain, departed for Andermatt, leaving Salome with her husband in the hospice. They did not leave without an altercation and a controversy between Mrs. Sidebottom and the hostess relative to the bill, in which both engaged with unmatched weapons, as Mrs. Sidebottom could speak no Italian, and Signora Lombardi no English. The former could not be brought to admit that the hostess was justified in charging somewhat higher for provisions 6,800 feet above the sea, than in the valleys where wine is produced and calves are reared. Mrs. Sidebottom effected no greater reduction than 1.5 francs, which she insisted on having expunged as a charge for a meal she protested she had not eaten. She then attempted to shift a couple of bottles of sparkling Asti from her account to that of Miss Durham, and to transfer sundry eggs for breakfast to the bill of Mrs. Baines, who she was sure had ordered them, though she admitted having eaten them on the urgency of Janet. Eggs 6,800 feet above the sea are, well, eggs. Fowls at that elevation are sluggish layers, and eggs, if brought up from the valleys, run risks of being broken on the road. Mrs. Sidebottom, who resisted paying a penny apiece for them when charged to her, saw that there was reason for setting that value on them when they were in Mrs. Bain's account. She fought desperately over the fish. There were lakes hard by the hospice doors, and fish in lakes easily procurable. Therefore it was unreasonable that they should be charged fancy prices. Mrs. Sidebottom achieved a great success in negotiating a bargain with the driver from Andermatt, whereby she and the captain were taken back by a returned carriage that had discharged its load at the hospice. She succeeded in securing the conveyance for half the ordinary price. Though she engaged the carriage for herself and her son, the captain did not return in it. But the three demoiselles Labarte, Janet, and the captain, who had become inseparable, and who reacted on each other, he reviving her health, and she evoking life and wit out of his torpid nature, returned in a smaller trap behind the carriage of Mrs. Sidebottom. Miss Durham had made her own arrangements, and went off in a cabriolet by herself. She took an almost affectionate farewell of Salome, whom she really liked, though she despised her. Miss Durham was sure she had done Salome a good turn in the way in which she had brought Philip to his senses, and she accordingly patronized and petted his simple wife. She was pleased with herself for having contributed to the happiness of the young wife by making a fool of her husband, and then telling him what a fool he had been made. Salome in her guilelessness reproached herself for having for a little while felt a suspicion of her husband and her friend, for having given way to a feeling of jealousy, for having been unhappy because Philip was so good and obliging as to make an effort to do what she had herself urged him to, make friends with the lonely American girl. And Philip, in him self-reproach grew. It could grow now, for the soil was ready for it. Hitherto it was choked with the roots of pride and self-esteem. These had been torn up, and he was able now to appreciate himself justly, and realize the preciousness of Salome. Formerly he had looked upon himself as having done a grand and gracious act in taking her to him. An injustice had been committed, how he did not know. In some mysterious way he had stooped in the integrity of his soul to take up Salome, make her his wife, so as to indemnify her for her loss. The suspicion he had entertained against his aunt relative to the will, before the return of his uncle, had been deepened, since he had talked the matter over with Jeremiah. He had now very little doubt that Mrs. Sidebottom had succeeded in getting at the document unguardedly kept by Salome, and tearing away the signature. But though he was tolerably convinced that this fraudulent act had been committed by her, he had not till now considered that by this act his family was dishonored, as was hers by the existence of Schofield. In what were the Pennycomequicks so much more virtuous than the Schofields? Earl Schofield, her father, was a swindler, and Louisa Sidebottom had committed an act that was felony. And what was he himself? He had wounded, driven from him with reproach and harshness, the most innocent, single-hearted of women, who was faithful to him and to her duties in every fibre of mind and body and soul. Whereas he, in a few hours, subjected to a slight temptation, had swerved from the path of right, had yielded to the fascination of the temptress, which he had not the moral strength to resist, and had been carried by her almost to a verge of committing a serious wrong. The unworthiness of Schofield could be cancelled by the unworthiness of Mrs. Sidebottom. There was not much choice between them. But what was there to set in the account to balance his deviation in heart from his duty to Salome, the injustice and cruelty with which he had treated her at Murgatroyd? Philip saw all this now clearly, and felt keen mortification and repentance. Salome was constantly with him, and he now, from his bed, and when he rose and walked leaning on her, had his eyes opened to see her many merits, to love the perfect purity and integrity of her soul. She was a child in heart, with the mind of a woman. She was not very clever, but she had common sense. She was well, but not highly educated. She had seen very little of the world, and this had necessarily given a narrow sweep to her powers. But her faculties were good, and with a widened range, her mind would rise to take an interest in all that was presented to her view. Hitherto he had liked Salome, appreciated her chiefly because she was a comfort to himself. Now he loved her for her own sake. Moreover, that little flare-up of jealousy in Salome's heart, a flare-up for which she accused herself before God on her knees, had transformed her regard for Philip into real love. The calm, lukewarm affection, sprung out of a sense of duty, had been changed by this spasm into ardent, passionate love. That was a cold and colourless world aloft on the summit of the St. Gothard Pass, and yet there the beautiful flowers of mutual love and trust between husband and wife came into blossom. "Philip," exclaimed Salome, coming into his room with a letter in her hand, "is it not kind of dear Janet? Here is another sweet note from her, telling me how darling baby is." "My dear, I know what a trial it is to you to be parted from him." "Oh, Philip, I am with you." Then opening the letter and showing it to him, "Only fancy, my father and Miss Durham have left the Imperial." "What? Left Andermatt?" "Yes." "Together?" "I do not know. Janet does not say. And Philip, she says you are to mind and get quickly well, for positively next week she and Lambert are to be married at the embassy at Bern. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 51. Again Hymen. Is there in all Europe a more delightful old-world town than Bern? There are grander minsters, there are more princely mansions, but there is no lovelier situation than that occupied by the dear old city, perched on a rock round which the green Aar forms a loop. May the great cancer of modern Bern that lies in the west never creep over and destroy the beauty of the ancient town, as the same horrible fungus growth is disfiguring and killing the charm out of nearly every ancient city on the continent. Even our common red brick houses are better than the vulgar ash-gray Jerusalem artichoke-colored edifices, all staringly alike, and equally uninteresting, that are growing up in long line and regular square in imperial Ace, in patrician Nuremberg, in episcopal spires, everywhere treading on and trampling out beauty. In 100 years, probably, all the great towns of the Middle Ages will have been transmuted from gold to lead, and be utterly unattractive. When we see a ruin of a church, an abbey, a castle, an old manor house, even a straw-thatched cottage, we are sad, for we think what they were, beautiful in their several ways, and all having lost much by becoming ruins. But of these modern edifices, everything we can say is that we live in hope that they may become ruins, for then only can they conceivably touch the picturesque. In England our builders have grasped the truth, that there is beauty in a broken skyline, and in an alternation of light and shadow in a frontage. But on the continent, in France, Italy, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, no architect has risen above the idea of drawing parallel lines, and of making every street an elementary study in perspective. On a brilliant summer day, when the sun was streaming down out of a perfectly blue sky into the long main street of Bern, alive with marketers, 3 cabs drew up at the entrance to the Hotel of the Wild Man, near the clock tower, and from them stepped, in the first place, a young man in light grey trousers and lavender gloves, and then a young and pretty lady wearing a bridal veil, a wedding dress of silver grey. From the second carriage descended 3 bridesmaids, no other than the Labarte girls, and from the third cab, Mrs. Sidebottom and Philip and Salome. Captain Pennycomequick had been married at the embassy to Janet Baines, and if the day's weather gave a true presage of the new life entered on, that of the captain and his bride was likely to be a happy one. But there were surer grounds on which to base a forecast of their hymeneal condition than the state of the weather. The captain was an amiable man, whom nothing would rouse to opposition, and Janet, as he and his mother had ascertained, was very comfortably off. She had, or would have, about 500 a year, and 500 per annum in France, where they intended to live, would allow of their enjoying themselves as much as if they had double that sum in England, not necessarily because things were cheaper in France, but because popular opinion allowed retrenchment in 1,000 of those trifles which in England are the great outlets that let money leak away. There was to be no wedding tour, not because Janet did not desire to escape with the captain from the rest of the party, but because the Labarte girls absolutely refused to be parted with. They had suddenly woke to the discovery that Mrs. Sidebottom had hoodwinked them, and carried them away out of sight and hearing whilst love-making was in progress. A veil had been torn from before their eyes, and they saw through all her dodges and subterfuges, and were in combined mutiny and angry protest. Henceforth nothing would sever them from their aunt. A great opportunity had been lost through the craft of that designing old woman. A passion on a grand scale had raged, so to speak, under their noses, and they had not sniffed it. Their attention had been drawn away, and they had been unable to make those interesting and instructive studies in the process of love-making to its grand climax in proposal, which might have been theirs, and been to them of incalculable interest and advantage, but for that dreadful Sidebottom. Thus, if they could no longer take observations in the conduct of lovers, they could examine and store up their observations on the conduct of newly married people in the honeymoon. They clung to their aunt with their arms about her neck. They lavished expressions of tenderness. They protested that they could not and would not be separated from her. And Janet foresaw that a wedding tour encumbered with the Labarte girls would be worse than none at all, or one with the Labarte girls plus Mrs. Sidebottom and Salome and Philip to draw them off from her occasionally. As the party drove from the embassy, Mrs. Sidebottom said to Philip, "By the way, what do you think? Wonders will never cease. Did you see the entries in the marriage register previous to those made by Lamb and Janet?" "I did not look." "I did, and whilst you were arranging about fees, I made inquiries. There was a marriage at the embassy this morning before our affair. An unheard of thing in Berne to have 2 English weddings the same day, so the chaplain said." "I dare say." "And guess who they were who entered the holy bonds?" "I really cannot. I know none likely." "But you do know, and are quite able to guess." "I have not the energy, then." "Why, Colonel Yeo, that is to say, Earl Schofield, and our friend at Andermatt, Miss Durham." "Nonsense!" Philip was startled. "It is a fact. I suppose he really is an earl, for he was entered in the register as Earl Schofield, not as Colonel Beeple Yeo." "But," Philip stammered, "it is not possible. He cannot." "He has. I saw the entries. They were married half an hour before we arrived." "I will inquire about it," said Philip, "as soon as ever the carriage stops. I will go back to the embassy. Something must be done. He had no right to marry." "Why not?" Philip did not answer. He was excited and uneasy. "You cannot go till after the breakfast," said Mrs. Sidebottom, "and I suppose it is too late to forbid the banns. I presume he is really an earl. He says that the attainder is up. He truly is a distinguished mannered man, and I like him. He looks a nobleman." In the evening the entire party visited the Champs-Élysées, a garden or restaurant on a commanding hill above Berne, once occupied by a fort from which it takes its name. From the terrace is seen the range of the Oberland Mountains, and in the middle distance below is the town viewed in its full length, with towers and spires and gabled roofs of chocolate brown tile. Visitors are attended on by waitresses in the pretty costume of the canton. The evening was lovely, a meet conclusion to so bright a day. The setting sun illumined the distant snows of the giants of the Oberland, and quivered in the windows of the city below. There are epoch-making scenes in life, scenes to which the memory recurs with unalloyed pleasure, scenes which have been revelations of beauty or majesty to the soul, and such a scene is that from the Champs-Élysées to the visitor who is there for the first time. It is a double revelation to him. The splendor of the glacier mountain world, and simultaneously with it, a realization of the beauty, the charm of that old world of the Middle Ages, which is being remorselessly and surely effaced, and on which in another century the men of that generation will be unable to look, or will know of it only a few scattered monuments, set in wastes of hideousness, and judge of it only as one might judge of the ocean by contemplating a few shells dug out of a chalk bed. The party of Pennycomequicks Sidebottom Labarte had settled itself to a marble-topped, or to be more exact, imitation marble-topped table, and had ordered the waitress to bring the cart of wines and meats, when Claudine Labarte nudged her aunt and whispered, "See, there they are, Monsieur le Comte de Scoville and our dear Artemisia. Shall we go to them?" "On no account," said Mrs. Pennycombe-Quick, that is to say, Janet, hastily. "Besides," she looked in the same direction, "they do not seem to desire our interference." All looked at the little table, not far distant, where sat Beeple Yao, alias Schofield, and his bride. The same day that had smiled on Lambert and Janet had laughed over them, but without sure augury of calm weather apparently, for already a post-nuptial storm had broken loose. Beeple Yao was leaning back in his green-painted iron chair, very red and blotched in face, and opposite him was Artemisia, whom he had just made his wife, flushed and talking rapidly. It was clear that they were in an angry altercation, about what could not be learned, for their voices were drowned by the music from the little theatre in the grounds, in which the overture to Baldeux's Jean de Paris was being performed. Beeple Yao curled his whisker round his forefinger, and said something in reply to a discharge of angry words from Artemisia. Whatever it was that he said, it so stung her that, losing all self-control, she sprang to her feet, leaned across the table, and struck him on the cheek. Beeple lost his equilibrium and went over with his chair on the gravel of the terrace, to the great amusement of the Swiss waitress, and of the scattered visitors at the tables, who had noticed the altercation. Artemisia was startled at her own violence, and ashamed. She looked round and caught sight of the friends she had made at Andermatt. Her colour was so heightened with passion that it could not become deeper with shame. Instead of resuming her seat, without regarding the humiliated man who was picking himself up from the ground, she came directly to the table where the party of Pennycomequick Sidebottom was seated, and with heaving bosom and flashing eye, she stood before Philip and said in a tone broken with excitement, "You have helped to deceive me. It was mean. It was cruel. You insulted me first of all, and then you conspired with this man to play me a base trick. It was unworthy of a gentleman, of an Englishman." "I beg your pardon," said Philip. "I do not understand of what you are speaking. I am quite unaware that I ever deceived you. You told me he was a nobleman, an earl, and he is nothing of the kind." "I never said he was." "I asked you, and you answered me that he was an earl." "I did no such thing. You misunderstood me. You asked me whether he had any right to the title of Earl of Schofield, and I answered, I recall exactly my words, that he was perfectly justified in calling himself Earl Schofield. That is his name. Whether he has any right to call himself Beeple Yao, and to claim to be a colonel, is another matter on which I entertain grave doubts, but I have none whatever that his surname is Schofield and that his Christian name is Earl." Artemisia did not speak for a minute. She was very angry and ashamed. When she had in some measure recovered her self-possession, she said bitterly, "You might have been more explicit." "I refused to say much about the man. I had my reasons. Moreover, I had no idea that the matter was one of importance to you. I have sold myself to him. I have married him this day, and only now have discovered that I have been basely imposed upon." "It is I who have been taken in," shouted Yao, coming forward, pushing to the table, regardless of the shrinking fear that appeared in the faces of Salome and Janet. "It is I," he repeated, "I that have been deceived." I was led to believe you were a wealthy American, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I want to know where is the money. You are an adventuress." "And you are an adventurer," laughed Artemisia. "Perhaps we have taken each other in, and we are both fools to have been so easily deceived. Who told you I was a rich American heiress?" "The waiter at the Imperial." "And he told me you were a rich milord." "I want to know what you really are," said Yao, who was also very angry and disappointed. "I have a right to know who or what manner of person I have married." "And I," said Artemisia, "I also want to know who and what manner of person I have married." "That perhaps I can tell you," said Philip gravely, "but not in the presence of these ladies. Mr. Schofield, or whatever you call yourself, I will trouble you to return to your table, or reseat yourself where you were. I see the waitress is in alarm, lest she should lose payment for what you ordered and have consumed." Beeple Yao sulkily went back to his place. Philip, with a sign, showed Artemisia that he desired her to follow. She obeyed. When they were beyond earshot of Mrs. Sidebottom, Salome, and the rest, Philip said, standing by the little table, "Mr. Schofield, I also wish to ask of you a question." "I am ready, my dear boy, to be put through my catechism," answered Yao with recovered assurance. "If you want the pedigree of Schofield, I have it at my fingers' ends." "It is not the pedigree so much as the alliances of Earl Schofield that interest me," said Philip. "Oh, the Schofields have been allied with the best blood in the land, better than your twopenny, halfpenny manufacturers." "I must ask you to tell me whether, before you married Miss Durham at the embassy today, you had ascertained that an alliance, not a very high one, was at an end." "What do you mean?" asked Yao, with his face slightly changing color. "You may happen to remember Ann Dewis, the coal barge woman whom you married at Hull some 16 years ago." Beeple uttered a low oath. "I have reason to know," continued Philip, "that she is alive, and you know that she is so, as well as I do. Miss Durham, this fellow had no right to marry you. His legitimate wife is still alive. No countess, but a vulgar old woman who owns and works a coal barge on the Kelldale Canal. He has a son by her. One good turn deserves another, and as you did me a real kindness at the Hospice, I repay it by freeing you from a degrading union just contracted with this wretched man, who is a mere adventurer and swindler. And now one word with you, Schofield. The evidence of your bigamy is at hand. Take care that you never show your face at Murgatroyd to annoy me or my wife, or that you trouble Janet. If you do, I shall have you immediately arrested on a charge of felony for what you have done today. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52 of the Pennycomequicks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pennycomequicks by Sabine BARING-GOULD. Chapter 52. The Devil's Knell. In Carisbrooke Castle is a deep well, 300 feet in depth, and in order to draw the water, there is contrived a great wooden drum or wheel, which when turned, draws up the bucket. Within the wheel stands a donkey, and it turns it by stepping on as if walking, although in fact the animal never advances an inch, for as it moves the wheel revolves under its feet. One ass was known to perform this task for 50 years, and another for 40 years. There is, unless we guard against it, a tendency in ourselves to fall into the same routine, tramping on, over the same ground, in the same unambitious manner, neither advancing in our course, nor varying our horizon. The acquaintance with Miss Durham had wrought much good in Salome as well as in Philip. She had opened his eyes to see his ignorance of himself, and hers to her ignorance of the world. Salome's previous existence had been within a narrow sphere, shut off by peculiar circumstances from forming many acquaintances and having many friends, with her horizon contracted almost within the walls of the dingy and ugly red brick house occupied by the Pennycomequicks, uncle and nephew, there can be no doubt but that she would in time have settled into a condition little superior to that of the Carisbrooke ass. Her mind would have trotted round and round in the same drum, and have accommodated itself without a murmur or a thought of resistance to it. In the course of years she would have become almost as ordinary, as petty-minded as the deceased Mrs. Cusworth. But contact with Miss Durham had startled her out of this intellectual donkeydom. She saw in the American girl a vivacity of interest, a breadth of view, a sparkle of intelligence, a receptivity for novel ideas, and a knowledge of the world and of the things in the world, the currents that circulated in it, the forces that propelled its waves and directed its tides, to which she had been completely strange. And this stimulated in her the desire to know. An American gentleman once said to the writer, "We have no prejudices, therefore we are always learning. That is the secret of American success in every branch of activity. Self-conceit breeds pig-headedness, which raises mountains of prejudice in our way, preventing us from seeing, as the Germans have it, that there are men beyond these mountains." Salome had noticed that Miss Durham was able at once, and without effort, to arrest the interest and enchain the attention of Philip, and this she attributed to the possession of qualities in the Chicago girl which were dormant, if not non-existent, in herself. She had the shrewdness to perceive, and the good sense to acknowledge, her own ignorance and inability to take part in conversation when it turned on politics, natural history, on music, art, or social questions of the day. She could talk about recipes for tapioca and semolina puddings, what proportion of water should be put with milk for a baby, the delinquencies of servants, the sermons she heard, the hymns she sang in church, the cutting out and style of address, but not on much beyond. Being humble-minded, she was ready to take to heart what she recognized, and she studied Miss Durham with attention to ascertain the points in which she was accomplished above her own acquirements. When ale in bottle turns flat, housewives put in a raisin, and this at once restores the effervescence. A prudent spouse should have a reserve of raisins ever by her, to pop into her husband's spirits whenever they are down. Some wives, however, act on the reverse principle, and perforate the corks, or knock off the necks of all the sparkling liquors in the cellars of their husbands' hearts. They cannot endure to see their good men cheery, sanguine, interested, hopeful. They reduce them all to the state of lymph and insipidity. Such wives, when they find their husbands strung to concert pitch, play the domestic accompaniment a semitone lower, so that the daily music of the household is a discord. They take the edge off their husband's wit with a sneer, overshadow his spirits when they sparkle, lash him to anger when he is pleased, and goad and spur him to madness when they find him jaded and desirous of repose. By a native perversity they seek to be always at cross purposes with their husbands, and then grumble because their victims do not smile and sing on the bed of nettles they have strewn for them. But Salome was not one who could degenerate into such a mar-piece as this. In her lowly mind, she acknowledged her deficiencies, and as she was endowed with energy and with excellent abilities, she determined to remedy these shortcomings in herself, and had the capacity to accomplish what she resolved. The forethought of Jeremiah Pennycomequick came to her aid opportunely. He also, by his holiday of 2 years, had been thrown out of his drum, and had found that there was another and a brighter world than that of the treadmill. He had discovered late in life that all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and not a dull boy only, but a cantankerous one. Man is a lantern, and the vivid intellect within is the light. By nature he is a lantern with many sides, through all of which the interior light streams, irradiating and bringing into prominence 1,000 surrounding objects. But the pressure of modern life forces him to blacken over one after another of these sides, and to line each with a reflector, so as to focus the light and cast it through a single lens. The stress of competition, the strain of the social struggle, combine to make of each man a bull's-eye lantern. It is true that the light so concentrated illumines such objects as fall within the radius of the beam with superior brilliancy, but it leaves everything else in more profound darkness. What is gained in intensity is lost in the periphery. Jeremiah had discovered this, and more than this. He had learned by his own weakness to take a more kindly interest in others, to be pitiful towards their infirmities, patient with their mistakes, and even follies. Having himself tottered irresolute on the edge of the commission of an extreme act of folly, from which he had been rescued solely by a providential intervention, he was able to make allowances for lack of judgment or weakness of resolve in others. Jeremiah saw that Philip had quarreled with Salome, and without inquiring into the occasion, he understood sufficient of their several characters to see that the best possible means he could adopt for reconciling the difference was to give them a holiday together abroad, to let them travel on the continent for some time, and mutually learn much of which both were ignorant. He accordingly wrote to Philip not to return to Murgatroyd till Christmas. He wished, so he said, himself to spend some months at the mill in recovering the threads of the business which had fallen from his fingers, and to settle thoroughly down again into the old groove of life. This enabled Philip, who was liberally supplied with money, to visit Paris, Rome, Milan, Venice, and return to England by the Rhine. He and Salome made traveling acquaintances, some agreeable, all instructive. They saw France staggering after its humiliation, and Germany ruffling in its pride of victory. They shared small adventures and equally small jokes, such as spring up on all travel, and are as poor to preserve as the flowers gathered. They saw together picture galleries, heard together operas, and together acquired a fund of experience of life in many aspects unattainable at Murgatroyd. The tour was, as Jeremiah designed, educative to both, and it broadened and deepened their mutual sympathies. It did more. It bound them together as chums in the same school, where both read out of the same books, and summed on the same slate, and wrote out the same moral sentences in their copybooks. As they learned together, they assisted each other. What escaped the eye of one was perceived by the other, and each took delight in drawing the attention of the other to what he or she observed. They laid up together a fund of pleasant recollections to which to revert when holiday was over and work began. A shifting diorama of scenes and incidents and personages that would transform and beautify the interior of the drum when they were recalled to the obligation of treading it. But not so only. When they returned to work, it would be to hope and scheme for such another excursion together in the future, though perhaps they could hardly look for another of the same duration. The retrospect would enrich, and the prospect stimulate, and banish tedium and the sense of drudgery from their life and work at smoky Murgatroyd. What veins of interest had, moreover, been open to both, flowers, scenery, pictures, music, antiquities, social customs, political institutions, European history past, and that making under their eyes, such were no longer dead words, but living interests, germs of thought, studies to be pursued at home in the intervals of work, in relaxations from task, by the aid of books and papers, and in common. As mention has been made of the saying of an American, the writer ventures to quote another, the remark made to him by a Belgian. I perceive that when a Flemish shopkeeper has realized a little money over the necessities of life, he says to himself, "Now I will buy a picture." The German, under the same circumstances, says, "Now my son shall learn another language." The American says, "Now I will see the world." The Englishman says, "Now I will have salmon, though it is 4 shillings a pound." They fill their minds, your man his stomach. There have been found toads embedded in stone, which are supposed to have occupied the same situation for even 6,000 years. For 6,000 years their minds have never traveled beyond the cavity in which, enveloped in obscurity, they have squatted. And men will allow themselves to settle down into holes exactly fitting them, in which they will sit out the span of their allotted days in self-complacency, without an idea beyond it, and ambition outside it. Indeed, we live upon a Goodwin sand that is ready to engulf us, to suck us down and embed us in its heart, unless we bestir ourselves and resist the downward suction. Let the reader look around him, and see how many of those he knows are embedded in their holes as toads, able only to talk about their holes, to be touched by nothing which does not affect their holes, are unconcerned about everything save the texture of the stone that encloses them, and the slime that drapes the walls of their hole. We do not say that the only means of escape from such bondage and mental stultification is continental travel. There are 100 ways of escape from petrifaction, if only we will use them, and use them persistently. In the case under consideration, it happened to be the way, and the most effective way, in which both Philip and Salome escaped from the holes into which they were about to sink and become sealed up. But there is one way in which the overplus of money will never help to deliver us from petrifaction, and that is by putting it into our stomachs, in the shape of salmon at 4 shillings a pound. We remember the case of a very short-sighted man, who had been short-sighted from infancy. He never wore glasses till he was aged about 25, and then suddenly found himself launched into a new world, and able to see and take a lively interest in things which had been hidden from him hitherto. We are all, through life, if we do not voluntarily become like the toad-hole dwellers, being introduced into new worlds, whether by the acquisition of a picture like the Fleming, or by learning a new language like the German, or by travel as the Yankee. Philip and Salome had put on their glasses simultaneously, and it quickened their affection for each other to be engaged on the same effort, and to be together in the acquisition of wisdom and knowledge and experience. Besides this intellectual and moral bond, they had another, certainly at the time not very intellectual, but a very fast and dear one, the little Philip, who traveled with them wherever they went, and who wound himself about both their hearts, and in doing so blended both in one. It was early in life for the child to begin his travels, but traveling did not hurt him. He throve on it. Before he said pa or ma, he articulated the syllable go. As Philip the Greater said, an augury of the young man's future as one of action. At length Philip and Salome were home, and once again Salome flew to the arms of the dear white-haired old man, whose face had lost all its hardness, and had acquired a new expression of sweetness. And Jeremiah was able to receive her loving embrace, and to hold her to his breast without shrinking, without a tremor. The storm had passed, and the St. Luke's summer had set in on his end of life, to be cheered not only by the presence of Salome, but also by that of Philip the Little, who, it was clear, would become the pet and idol of old Jeremiah, even more than he was the pet and idol of his father and mother. Late at night, in the nursery, at the nursery window on Christmas Eve, when Philip the Great and Philip the Little and Salome were returned to Murgatroyd, husband and wife stood looking out into the star-besprent wintry sky. Salome had her arms round Philip's waist, and he had his thrown over her shoulder, drawing her to his side, and she rested her golden head on his breast. The only light in the room came from the fire. The only sound for some time was the breathing of the child in its cradle. Both were happy and occupied with their own thoughts. At length Philip broke the silence and said, "It is very, very good of Uncle Jeremiah. He has taken me into full partnership, and what is more, he proposes that he should winter abroad and return in spring, to allow of our then taking a holiday together." "And what is he going to do about Mrs. Sidebottom?" "I cannot say. He is himself undecided. He says that as he laid the trap into which she fell, he must not be too hard with her. He will see her himself. He goes after the New Year to France, when he will visit her and make some arrangement. He says, but can hardly mean what he says, that it is a law of nature, that persons pinched in circumstances and pressed for money lose their scruples, as crabs cast their claws, and lizards drop their tails when nipped or pursued. It is a law of nature, and must be allowed for. Philip felt a shudder of protest against his side, but Salome said nothing. All at once she started. "Oh, Philip, what is that?" A sound issued from the cradle. She ran to it, stooped, and looked at her baby. The flashes of the firelight were reflected from the ceiling on the little face. "Hark! Oh, hark! Philip, baby is laughing aloud in his sleep. He has never done that before. It is from very joy at being home, at his own dear home again." "What, Salome? After Paris and Rome, the Alps and the Rhine, poor old dirty, dingy Murgatroyd is dear?" "To be sure it is, Philip. How can it be otherwise? And oh, Philip, how kind the people are! How pleased they all seem to see us back again! I really thought they would have shaken my hand off, and that old Fanshawe, the night watch, would have kissed me, Philip. There may be more light-hearted, more picturesque, more romantic people in other lands, but there can be nowhere, not throughout the world, more true, warm-hearted, sterling folk than our dear Yorkshire people. Do you not love them, Philip?" "I have given Yorkshire the best proof of my attachment, in taking to me a wife from thence." "Oh, Philip!" Salome nestled to his side again by the window, and with him again looked forth silently into the night sky. After a long pause, Philip said, "Hark!" Through the still night air could be heard the church bell. 3, 3, 3. "Some man is dead," said Philip. "How strange! At midnight." Then he counted the strokes that denote the age. He counted to 100. 100! exclaimed Philip. "How extraordinary! How can that be?" "Philip," said Salome, laughing, "do you not know? It is the devil's knell." "The devil's knell?" "Yes. At midnight on Christmas Eve, the sexton here and in other Yorkshire towns tolls the knell. The devil is dead, Christ is born." After a moment's thought, Philip said gravely, "Yes, the devil is dead. That is to say, the old evil principle in me, my former self-assurance, pride, and mistrust, it is dead. But, Salome, I ought to tell you that there was a time, and not so long ago, when She put her hand over his mouth. "The devil is dead," she said. "I want to hear nothing of his last sickness." "But, Philip, you ought to know that I was, at Andermatt, very foolish, very He stopped her with a kiss. "Salome, you were never foolish. You were always an angel." "Well," she said, "we will not talk of the past. We will set our faces to the future. The devil is dead." End of chapter 52, and end of the Pennycomequicks, by Sabine BARING-GOULD. This audiobook is a 2015 LibriVox production. All recordings and book coordination by Michael Reese. Dedicated proof listening and editing services by Maxine Marie Montague of Eastport, Maine. LibriVox administration, meta-coordination, and cataloging by Gypsy Girl. Source texts for this work are Gutenberg.org ebooks, volumes 48161, 48162, and 48163, produced by Al Haynes. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.